Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the panel discussion on federal funding related to building improvements by Stantec. It looks like we've got folks here from around the country, Stafford County and Virginia represented. Welcome. Portage Public Schools in Michigan, Splendora ISD in Texas. Welcome. Welcome, everybody. And it looks like we've also got a healthy handful of colleagues from firms with whom we compete too. Well, glad to have you here as well. Rising tide. That's right. Welcome aboard. My name is Bill Bradley. I'm a principal architect in Stantec's Charlottesville, Virginia studio, and I co-lead our East Coast Educational Design Studio. With me today are three distinguished colleagues from Stantec, whom I'll introduce properly in a moment. But first, a word about our purpose here today. Our focus, as I'm sure you know, is understanding the federal funds that are being made available in response to the COVID pandemic. We've assembled experts in funding, building systems, and the design of learning environments who are each well-versed in the ARP ESRA funds. I have a series of questions that I'll ask each in turn, aimed at shedding light on the subject in a way that we hope answers the questions that you might already have. To the extent that you don't anticipate or address your questions, though, please use the chat feature to ask whatever questions you might have. I'll circle back at the end and ask these questions from the audience. With that, give me a moment here to advance. Let me introduce Heidi Pepper. Heidi is a senior funding leader in Stantec's St. Cloud, Minnesota studio. Heidi lends more than 25 years of experience in community and economic development, solving complex funding problems for all sorts of projects, including funding for capital projects. Heidi is the East lead for Stantec's North American Funding Program, and which is a coordinated network of more than 150 funding specialists from across the country. Her experience in project development and securing affordable financing packages has resulted in securing more than $180 million for clients' projects. Heidi, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Bill. Heidi Pepper. And, you know, as Bill mentioned, as the U.S. East lead for our North America Funding Program, I'm part of a team that has been monitoring and analyzing all of the funding that's been coming out of the federal government for the last year and a half now. So excited to talk about this particular pot of money shortly.
Thanks, Heidi. Our second panelist is Kaz Zaleski, who is a principal engineer in Stantec's Berkeley, Michigan office, which is right outside of Detroit. For the majority of his 25-year career, he's been focused on educational facilities, working with over 30 districts from the Midwest to the Gulf region. Kaz's experience includes solutions of all shapes and sizes for everything from facility conditions assessments and retro commissioning to select infrastructure, deferred maintenance, and large capital improvements in new buildings as well. Kaz is widely published, sharing thoughts on everything from industry trends and innovative solutions to educational design challenges. And he volunteered at the local middle school and high school to support students' interests in building industry and the sciences. Kaz, welcome.
Thank you, everyone. Looking forward to talking to everybody a little bit more about the system side and how you're able to kind of take the funding that's out there and really be able to make some wonderful improvements to your facilities.
Thank you, Kaz. All right, last but certainly not least, Shivani Langer, who is a principal architect in our Austin, Texas studio, where she's also our sustainability design leader for the U.S. Central region of Stantec. Shivani lends over 20 years experience working in both K12 and higher education, with an emphasis on net zero projects. She's been in Stantec's sustainability research and benchmarking program since 2013, where she and her teams have completed empirical studies on everything from post-occupancy evaluations of buildings to detailed analysis of various aspects of sustainability, with the goal of constantly learning and informing our projects going forward. In addition to her work with Stantec, Shivani is a member of the board of directors of the USGBC's Central Texas Council. Welcome, Shivani.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Bill. And welcome, everyone, to the webinar. like Bill mentioned, I'm here to give the perspective of an architect. I'm an architect and also a sustainability leader. As the research that we've been doing in our research and benchmarking program has informed us over the years how important looking at health and wellness of our occupants is and how our facilities can impact their well-being. And I think that is a key component of our discussion today. Because of COVID, we are talking a lot about health and wellness, and I will be talking a little bit more about how our facilities design and what you can do within this funding can help us improve their well-being, the user well-being. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Shivani. So all three of our panelists are awesome, and I think that you'll enjoy and appreciate their insights. So with that, let's begin. And Heidi, let's start with you. What federal funding programs have been proposed of late, and of those, which are applicable to our discussion today?
Yeah, so as I alluded to, there's been a lot of funding coming out in the last year and a half, and there's a lot of conversation and confusion, I think, out there in terms of what's been passed, what's been enacted versus what's proposed and hopefully yet to come. So going back to March of 2020, we saw the first relief package, CARES Act, $2.2 trillion. The biggest relief package to date, but very, very focused on relief, recovery, immediate response to the pandemic. Then at the end of last year in December, we saw the Consolidated Appropriations and Supplemental Coronavirus Act totaling over $2 trillion for the two of them. And then most recently, March of 2021, we saw the American Rescue Plan Act. And to date, this is the most flexible pot of money. And within the American Rescue Plan, or ARP, is elementary and secondary school emergency relief, or ESSER funding, and that's the focus today. But I also want to mention three plans that have been proposed by the Biden administration that we are continuing to monitor. So we have the American Jobs Plan, the President's 2022 budget request, as well as most recently, the American Family Plan. So again, those last three buckets are proposed, but we are monitoring them because we think they will be important for not only our schools, but cities and local governments as well. So let's dive into the American Rescue Plan Act a little bit and see what was included in that $1.9 trillion. So you can see there on the slide all the various buckets of funding for that. And again, we're still seeing a lot of funding on the relief and recovery from the pandemic. But education, fared pretty well, kind of right in the middle of that stack in terms of dollar amounts, $176 billion, of which $122 billion is the elementary and secondary school emergency relief, or ESSER program. So that, in a nutshell,
All right.
what we've seen to date.
Thank you, Heidi. You mentioned the $122 billion that's earmarked for elementary and high schools. Of that, for what can those funds be used exactly?
Yes, so while this is the most flexible use of federal funding to date, and of the ESSER funds. So let me back up a little bit and say that with the CARES, the Supplemental Corona, and now ARP, we have different versions of ESSER. So they're referred to as ESSER 1 in the CARES Act, ESSER 2 in the Supplemental Fund, and now with ARP, we're seeing some people refer to it as ESSER 3 or ARP ESSER. So ARP ESSER is, again, the most flexible, but the underlying purpose for the use of these funds still needs to be tied to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're looking at allowing us to reopen schools safely, maximizing our in-person instruction time, and addressing the impact that the COVID pandemic is having on our students. Furthermore, states and local educational agencies, so from now on, instead of local educational agency, I'm going to say LEA, They're encouraged to consider how using these funds can help address inequities that we're seeing, and specifically supports and services for our underserved students. So we're talking about low-income families, students of color, students with disabilities, English learners, and others who've been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. There are also specific reservations where the ARP ESSER funding must be reserved for using. One is 20% must be reserved for loss of learning, loss of instruction time. Beyond that, there's 4 broad categories for the use of these funds. The first is reopening our schools safely and promoting the health and safety of our students, staff, and school community. So that can mean facilities conditions assessments and planning related to our building envelopes and mechanical systems. It could also be repairing and improving those school facilities and mechanical and HVAC systems. The second bucket is advancing educational equity in COVID-19 response. So there we're looking at the activities specific to address the unique needs of our underserved populations, as well as providing mental health services and supports through implementation of evidence-based full-service community schools. The third bucket is to support our educators and school staff. So training and professional development, funding for additional school counselors and nurses. Then that last category is additional fiscal considerations. So these are other activities that are necessary to maintain operations and continuity of our school services.
All right, you mentioned equity, and I want to come back to that in a moment. But first, what are some of the things that are important for school districts and local agencies to think about when considering using these funds?
There's several things, Bill, that they should be thinking about. First, in determining whether an activity is an eligible use of these funds, they should ask themselves 3 questions. Can I tie the use of these funds to preventing, preparing for, or responding to the COVID-19 pandemic? So again, including the impacts on social, emotional, mental health, academic needs of our students. The second question is, does the use of these funds fall under one of the authorized uses of ESSER funds? So those 4 categories that I described. And then lastly, is the use of this fund necessary and reasonable for the performance of the ESSER award?
All right, very good. That's pretty clear. Now, what's not as clear perhaps is, the U.S. Treasury mentions evidence-based often in their guidance. And so what does it mean for a program to be evidence-based?
The ARP Act defines evidence-based as having several tiers of evidence. And I'm going to read from the definition here. Specifically, evidence-based, when used with respect to a state, LEA, or school activity, means an activity, strategy, or intervention that shows correlation between that activity and improving the student outcome or other relevant outcomes. And it can be based on a study, a collection of studies, with ongoing efforts to examine the effects of that activity, strategy, or intervention on the performance of our students. And depending on the number and quality of those studies or the research findings determines the tier of evidence-based. So there's 4 tiers, 1 through 4, with 1 being the strongest evidence-based.
Okay, let's go back and touch on equity. At the heart of the ESSER funds is the intent to address disparities and provide services more equitably. So can you speak a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. Throughout the guidance, there is a focus on serving our underserved student populations, as there is a recognition that they have been disproportionately impacted, negatively impacted by COVID-19. So I mentioned reservations that are being pulled out of ARP ESSER, and those reservations include 3 state-level reservations that are reserved for activities and interventions that respond to our students' academic, social, and emotional needs and addresses that disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on our underrepresented student subgroups. Additionally, there is strong encouragement for our LEAs to consider and address the equitable use of the funds for those student populations. And they do a couple of specific call outs for that. So supplemental instruction to address the academic impact of loss of instruction time. After school programs, weekend programs, summer programs, looking at facilities for students to access reliable internet connection for remote learning. Covering fees that might be associated with drop-in centers operated by community organizations, as well as transportation to school or the drop-in centers, other facilities where students can access necessary technology and instructional support.
Thank you. Shivani, how can decisions about capital improvements address these issues of equity that Heidi just elaborated on?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bill. You know, Heidi, you mentioned a lot of ways in which the funding addresses equity. And as far as on the sides of the building professionals, I think we can be reached out to for doing facilities assessments of the schools within the school district. So if the LEAs can reach out to the local professionals who can do a very extensive facilities assessment of the schools to see where should we even begin, right? What is the schools that are the most impacted, the communities that are most impacted because of COVID? Like you mentioned, Heidi, they do specifically list the communities that we should be catering to. And I think as design professionals, we can provide that service where we visit each school and see how can we improve. And we'll be talking a little bit more about facilities improvements, but what will be our baseline? Where is the most impacted community and impacted school? And how do we bring all the schools up together? So we look at, you know, what components of the schools, of which schools are making coming back to school more difficult and not as safe, because that's one of the biggest categories in funding, is how can we make going back to school safer? So once we do the facilities assessment, and I think Kaz can add on to that, as far as, you know, we're not just talking about buildings here, we're talking about systems and how can we address the baseline issue.
And that's exactly right, Shivani. So when we're looking at these different schools and these buildings, and you're looking at equity, and you know you're looking at all of these different spaces, how are they operating right now? And you know, I'm gonna be talking a little bit more in a bit about ventilation. But when you're ultimately doing this assessment, you're really trying to understand how are all of these spaces getting that fresh air. How are all of the systems ultimately supporting the learning environment? And that can be in regards to the lighting systems, the ventilation systems, as I mentioned. You know, also, is the space comfortable? You know, one of the biggest key factors is trying to make sure that all of the students are always warm, safe, and dry. So addressing all of those items very specifically as part of that assessment is kind of integral to this whole process.
Yeah. Exactly, like you said, Kaz, and I think then once the facilities assessment is done, then it is going to be a task to come up with a master plan. So how are we going to address the issues that we saw in facilities assessment and make a plan of how to use the funds equitably within the entire school district or LEAs, like Heidi mentioned? The other big component of the funding that we have seen is that they do require community engagement. So it is the LEA's responsibility to get community feedback. And I think that also addresses the issue of equity. It's interesting that our school district, where my kids go to, they've actually already sent us a survey, a 2-minute survey, as to what we think the funding should be used for. And that survey has gone on to the entire school district. So every parent in every community, whether it's low income, you know, kids that have been impacted really badly due to COVID, they all get to enter into the survey what are the challenges that they see that the kids went through this year, and what challenges are they going to go next year, and what are the most important things that the funding should be used for. So that is a really big component of funding, that community engagement has to be brought in to allow for equity as well. And local professionals can help with that, can help us provide the list of the categories for which to survey the parents as well.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Shivani. That is one of the things that's new with ARP ESSER that we didn't see in ESSER 1 or ESSER 2. That's that requirement for planning, not only at the state level. So the state level needs to make publicly available their plan for the use of ESSER and reopening safely our schools. But the LEAs also need to do that within 30 days of receipt of those funds to make that available on its website. And part of that planning process needs to be that wide, diverse community engagement that you spoke about.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Why don't we pivot and step inside the building? And Kaz, let's start with you. Relative to these funds, what does it mean to upgrade heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems in response to the pandemic?
You know, what it typically comes down to is there's many components, but the three major components that you're looking at really kind of looks at ventilation, filtration, and automation. So if we start off with ventilation, it's really coming down to fresh air. How much fresh air is being able to get to the students, to those different learning environments, to all of those different spaces to make sure that people have the right amount of fresh air. And it's not just how is it being introduced. So it can be through many different means. So we talked a little bit about equity. And when you think about equity, there's so many different distribution systems that are out there, and we won't get into all of the specifics, but everyone's familiar with the beige box, and there's stuff that's overhead, and maybe it's operable windows, depending if your climate allows it. But ultimately what we're looking at with these funds is how is that ventilation air getting in? And we kind of talked about understanding what that baseline was. There's so many different, local codes, ordinances. There's the National Standards Organization. So as an engineer, we typically lean pretty heavily on ASHRAE, the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. And they have a lot of guidance on what are the requirements for ventilation. So working with your professional, they can come up with all different types of assessments and strategies of how to make an equitable solution and look at the overall district to say, this is how we can improve your overall ventilation component. And as part of that, the next piece that normally will come up is filtration. So for most people, I feel like everyone has at least heard of MERV. It's a rating system about how effective filters are. And same thing, ASHRAE has their recommendations that say, you really want to have a MERV 13. Well, that beige box or that overhead system might not necessarily be able to you can't just put in that filter system. And we'll probably touch more on that in a little bit. The last piece that we really want to talk about is automation. So automation is controls. A lot of systems have what's called demand control ventilation. There's CO2 sensors. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to reduce how much fresh air is coming in based upon occupant loading. Well, that is great when we're looking more from an overall energy saving function, but when you're trying to make sure that there's enough fresh air so that all of the occupants, especially when you're in kind of this pandemic mode, it's understanding what are those programmatic changes that need to happen. And then besides that, there's a lot of studies that have been done regarding kind of a pre and post purge of the different spaces. So as you have all of these folks that are coming into the space, the idea is bring in additional ventilation ahead of time. So these are all programmatic changes, and there's a cost associated with this. So there's these funds that are available that you can make programmatic changes or potentially even address the main infrastructure itself.
Thank you, Cass. Sorry, I was taking myself off of mute. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the challenges with doing so?
Certainly. So, one of the big challenges that pops up quite a bit is it really comes down to climates. When we say that we want to bring more fresh air in, if you're in a cold climate, your heating capacity just might not be there. So again, I keep kind of talking about like, you know, whether it be the old-fashioned black box. Again, I like to refer to everything as the beige box because everyone's got some kind of like beige box somewhere in the room or hidden away in some mechanical space that's ultimately trying to bring some kind of air in. So the capacity might not be there to be able to handle what that cold climate is. And in the same token, when you're looking at a warm, humid climate, you might not have the cooling capacity that you need. So now, just because you're bringing more fresh air into the space does not mean that it's conducive to learning. You're most likely going to be outside of kind of the operating temperature and humidity requirements that you want to be maintaining, so that you're not having any kind of growth issues. You're not having any other of those issues that kind of happen when you're not in a controlled environment. So when it really comes down to the challenges, there's a lot that has to do with the climate and then the overall equipment and configuration. Those mechanical systems or those operable windows, you know, they're only going to be able to do so much. An operable window is going to bring that fresh air in. And in a cold climate, that student that's sitting right next to it, bundled up in a jacket, isn't necessarily going to have the best learning environment. And the same thing's true when you're in a very warm environment, when you're sitting right next to that window. So having that understanding of what the existing equipment can handle, and ideally, any district would be bringing in a professional. That professional can look at what is that existing equipment capable of, how much fresh air, what's the capacity. When we start talking about these funds as well, it's also about what is the central capacity. So when you're looking at, you know, whether it's a central heating plant, cooling plant, maybe it's a geo exchange system, whatever those different systems and capacities are, the more that we start bringing fresh air in, we need to be looking at what's the energy recovery devices, what are all the capacities, because ultimately we want to make sure that the learning environment is appropriate for all parties and that it's meeting all of those standards of care regarding what's the proper amount of ventilation.
Well, again, it comes back to a question of equity in some ways. A lot of talk out there, a lot of promotion of emerging technologies. Can you talk a little bit about that? What are some of them and what are your thoughts on them?
Certainly. So, you know, there's three of them that kind of just pop right up off the top. And there's a lot of different kind of like add-on filtration systems that are out there. I'm sure people have heard of UVC, which is kind of an ultraviolet technology, and also a little bit about different ionization technologies. So all of these things have a certain amount of merit, but it really kind of comes down to its application. So when we look at, you know, applying one system or another to a specific piece of equipment, we have to be a little bit cautious about its application. There's all these different studies that are out there that will say that, you know, this type of equipment works fantastic, but it's normally set up, it works great when the following conditions are met. So if you're thinking about, you know, doing some sort of filtration add-on, if you're thinking about like adding something for like, again, UVC type technology or one of these ionization, just understand that a lot of it has to do with the specific application and working with a professional so that they can kind of guide you through what those applications are and all of the fine print associated with how the equipment needs to be used to make sure that it's effective. That's really the best recommendation that I can give regarding all of these different technologies out there.
All right, thank you, Kaz. As I take a sip of water, what about hydration? Drinking fountains are off limits, and how else can we provide water to buildings occupants?
So, you know, when I go to most of the districts now, or even to the health club or wherever, you know, all of the water spouts on the drinking fountains, electric water coolers, whatever they might have there, there's typically some sort of lock or a sign that says, stay away. Like, you just need to be away from those. This funding is an excellent opportunity to be able to provide kind of those automatic bottle fillers. And what most people know if they realize is that a lot of these bottle filler systems also have filters built into them. And depending upon where you're at, you know, your local water quality might not always be the best. So by through this funding, you can kind of go through and say, all right, let's do an analysis of what is the overall water quality. What is our approach to being able to deliver, you know, kind of that touchless water to our students? So is it bottle fillers? If you are fortunate to have, you know, potentially sinks within the classrooms and there's going to be that water spout associated with it, there's these different, I'm not going to say technologies, but there's these different fixtures and kind of add-on components now that you can either have a meter type device, touchless, or you can have it where it's kind of a lever operated where you're not having to use your hand to be able to fill these different bottles and these different containers. And all of this again ties directly to the funding for making sure that you're not spreading and you're making it very safe for folks to be able to get drinking water. And it doesn't just stop there. I mean, when you look at this, you know, I'm talking a lot about the water source side of things, but as you go into kind of the restroom design and there's a greater architectural component really associated with this.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good cue to hand off to Shivani. But before I do, I want to remind folks who are tuning in, if you have questions, please do enter them in the chat. Shivani, what other improvements might be done in buildings in response to the pandemic?
Yeah, Kaz covered a lot, Kaz, thank you. And I would say, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about when the schools were opening. You know, in Texas, schools did open hybrids. They did have, you know, options for people to come, the students to choose whether they could go into the school or be virtual. So you know, I can talk a little bit more about the overall facility, but at a smaller scale, queuing in from Kaz, because he talked about the drinking fountains, you know, restrooms, right? I know right now we are talking about COVID, but we have seen flu. We have seen spread of germs in schools happening all the time. You know, as soon as you had a flu in a school, we would get an email and we would be like, oh gosh, I hope my kid doesn't get it, right? So because it happens all the time. So I know we're talking about it now, but you know, touchless fixtures. I know a lot of school districts looked into that right after COVID hit. That is something really great. It also saves water, actually. So we can talk about plumbing fixtures that are touchless. We have been doing a lot of airport style restrooms where once the kids wash their hands, they don't need to open a door to come out. There are no doors to the entry to the restrooms. We talk about having paper towel dispensers so that, you know, you are not bringing in that water out, but again, touchless paper towel dispensers. There is a discussion about having door stops at classroom doors. So all kids are not constantly opening. There is a change, especially in secondary schools. There is a constant movement of kids from one classroom to the other. Can we keep the door open with a door stop so that kids are not constantly touching the, you know, hardware? So we can talk about hardware. We can talk about door pulls that you have seen in restaurants now. Many more restaurants now have door pulls in restrooms as well. There is isolation rooms with separate HVAC systems. So that's a big one. I know that we are doing that in new facilities now. So there's a change that we had nursing rooms, but we did not have isolation rooms. So that's another one that we can definitely look at. A very simple one that I think we can incorporate in existing facilities is wayfinding. We will get a new set of students coming into our schools in August. Can we have very simple wayfinding so that the kids are not going where, you know, they don't need to be, and then they're also again getting exposed to more germs? Let the movement of kids happen only where it needs to, for where they need to go. So wayfinding is a very easy way. Cleaning. I know the cleaning has been extensive and very much required, but there are two cautions that I want to, you know, end this part of the conversation. Is that there is a lot of cleaning happening, and we will we hope that everyone is using, you know, the certified green cleaning components, because we don't know what that is going to cause in terms of physical and mental stress for students and staff that are going to occupy right after that cleaning. There's a lot of sanitizing, so we need to be careful of operations during this time as well. And then I want to end this part with antimicrobials. Right after COVID hit, there was a lot of discussion about antimicrobials in materials. And there is a big caution there that there is not enough research that shows that they are good, but there's enough research that shows they're not good. There are carcinogens. There are many more health hazards to antimicrobials than good components. So really caution. You know, just like Kaz said, there's a lot of technology out there, but let's not use the technology till there is enough research proven that that truly helps. So those were some small scale implements that we can do to our facilities, though.
Thank you, Shivani. So one of the things that certainly changed as a result of the pandemic is this idea of virtual or hybrid learning, right? So what can we do to make that more successful?
Great question. So a very big, you know, I know that we are all familiar with classroom, with school designs, which are rigid in classrooms, right? We have classroom spaces that are known to be classroom spaces that can occupy certain students. But what happened during COVID was that there were some teachers, and including my kids, did not go in person. And there were some teachers that were virtual only. There were some teachers that were in person. There were some teachers that were hybrid. And I think it is really important for facilities to have diversified learning opportunities. So spaces that can be designed, can be used for hybrid learning, specialized spaces for virtual teaching. So the spaces that can have very good infrastructure. And, you know, we talked a little bit about mental stress, right? I think the teachers do already have a lot of things to do, and not having the right infrastructure to teach and be versatile enough to go from in-person to online to hybrid. I think as facilities designers, we can help making the spaces as versatile and as flexible as possible in terms of infrastructure. But also, we are constantly incorporating, at least in our new schools, very, you know, movable partitions where the schools classrooms can be small group learning and then overall large scale learning. So if we can have that kind of flexibility, that is going to help us cater to any kind of pandemic or emergency that we can handle in the future. The last one I want to add is outdoor learning, right? I mean, I think outdoor learning is something that can be incorporated in existing facilities too. And that also provides, and having the infrastructure there as well for virtual learning does help us also make and give teachers an option to have flexible teaching environment.
All right, thank you. And you anticipated my question about the mental stress that's involved with teaching and learning, right, in a pandemic. And so is there anything else that you'd like to add about what we might do to facilities to provide for better wellness for occupants?
Great question. I was waiting for that, you know, for us to talk about it, because I know Heidi mentioned in a couple of her discussions about funding. Funding talks constantly about how we can help help our teachers and students that have been impacted so much by COVID. And, you know, I know we're talking about COVID, but school safety, there are so many things that have, over the years, increased the mental stress that the students and the staff have gone through. And as Heidi also talked about evidence-based design, and there is a lot to be said about how indoor environments can truly affect the stress of the occupants. So there is a connection to nature. I think that has been proven time and again to reduce the stress. So it is easier in new facilities for sure. We do incorporate as much daylighting as possible, as much connection to nature as possible. But I think the biophilia is a concept of connections to nature, which also talks about how we can bring in nature to the inside. So incorporating plants, incorporating wayfinding, which is local plants, local greenery around the students and teachers, really helps reduce the stress. The nature is known to reduce stress. In any way we can do that. Plus, I mentioned briefly outdoor environments. Not just outdoor learning, but also outdoor dining, right? Because that is something that if there are studies that show that if the kids have the same class outside versus inside, they actually have less, or they do less interruptions in the class after that class. So truly, teachers are so mentally stressed. Can we actually give them more kids that are more engaged in class rather than be disruptive in class? And a simple outdoor environment can help with that. So talking about, but also promotion of activity. The kids can take out their energy when they are more active, whether that is indoor, incorporating stairs, or outdoor. That helps a lot with reducing stress. And I already talked about flexibility and good infrastructure. I think we've seen that the stress levels were higher because there was not enough infrastructure to do the kind of teaching that COVID made them do. And making sure that we provide them with that infrastructure is a big way forward to reduce stress as well.
Thank you, Shivani. All right, by way of time check, we're at 45 minutes. We've got about 15 minutes to go. So I want to ask the panelists some of the questions that have come in from the audience. And the first one appears to be for you, Heidi. Heidi talked about one of the differences between ARP ESRA and ESRA 1, 2. What is new under ARP ESRA that's different from 1 or 2?
Thank you for that question. There are a few things that are new. So as you alluded to, I mentioned already, the planning component is new with ARP ESRA that we didn't see in ESRA 1 or 2. So in addition to the state and the LEA having to do and submit those plans, make them publicly available, the LEA must also review them at a minimum of every 6 months and revise as needed. Also, there again was that reservation of 20% needs to be used to specifically address the loss of learning that we experienced in 2020. Additionally, the state must maintain equity for high poverty schools, and they may not reduce funding, what they're calling a maintenance of effort for fiscal year 2022 and 2023. So the federal government is making sure that our state governments are not reducing funding to our LEAs because of this influx of money. So those are a few of the major items that are new with ESRA 3 or ARP ESRA.
Thank you, Heidi. Shivani, this next question is for you. Shivani mentioned biophilic design in her answer about mental health. It's a two-parter. The first one, I hope this isn't putting you on the spot, but how do you spell biophilic? And what are some examples?
Awesome. Great. Okay, I'll try and get this right, but BIOPHILIC. So, okay.
That's
I
what
hope
I've got
right.
too.
I think I did. Okay. Okay. The second one, very good question, and I would we can definitely follow up with a more detailed answer to this. But biophilia actually has 15 design principles, And it lists the design principles in different categories, like nature in the space, nature of the space, nature analogs. So those are the three big main categories. And under that, it lists all the ways that you can, how do they define that? So some examples, like I mentioned, one was bringing in daylight, providing views, but many other ways are to, water, like sensory ways. And like I said, being outdoors is incorporating all the senses together. So that's the best way to incorporate biophilia. But in existing facilities, in facilities that we can do, you can bring in plants. And so there are nature analogs that you can actually have materials that touch and feel like nature. So we have been using wood a lot in our projects, color, not having too many straight lines, organic forms of furniture. Even furniture can be incorporated within, but lighting, ceiling clouds, the niches, they also call it places of refuge, like you will see in nature, places that are provide mystery. So we've done a recent treehouse in a project where there was a spiral staircase going up to the treehouse, which was both a place of refuge and also provided mystery and also adventure. So there are many, anything that connects a person to nature is considered biophilic design. And hopefully I gave a few examples of it. I want to make sure we have enough time for other questions, but I can definitely follow up with a huge list and a very well documented different strategies. Yes, thank you.
Heidi, I think this is for you. When is the deadline for funds to reach the district, and when is the deadline to spend it?
Yes. So the deadline to spend it, I'll answer that first because that is by the end of 2024 for ARPA. In terms of rolling this money out, so 2/3 of the allocated funding should already be hitting the streets. But what we are seeing is there's a great diversity of how states are rolling this out under the parameters of ARP ESSER. So it's a little harder to answer that question. I am seeing, so I took a look at where our audience is from today, and it looks like we have a lot of folks from Virginia, Maryland, Texas, and Michigan. So I took a look at those, and it looks like Michigan, it's still hung up in the legislature in terms of various requirements. And then I'm seeing that the applications already are hitting the street in Virginia and Texas. So there's just a wide diversity of when schools can expect these funds. So I hate to provide just a blanket opening, but it's kind of hard to follow this money. Like I said, we have a team of folks following it, but even we can get stumped sometimes.
Certainly. All right, thank you. And Heidi, I don't know if this is for you, maybe Shivani, or maybe it's something we need to research further and get back on, but are there pre-approvals that are required by the Texas Education Agency?
So, yeah, absolutely. So in terms of using ARP ESSER for construction, that does require, whether it's Texas, Maryland, Michigan, that requires pre-approval of using ARP ESSER funds for construction, modifications, repairs, new construction. Above and beyond that, and specific to T, I'm not sure what other pre-approvals they might require, but I know universally for construction, pre-approval is required.
Okay. Shivani, anything to add to that?
No, I think that was my understanding. And Heidi, it is true for every state, right? I don't think we've seen that to be different for any between the states.
Right, universally, construction needs to be pre-approved by the state education agency.
So sure this might be for, but expanding food programs are part of the acceptable improvements under the funding stipulations. Would these funds, for instance, allow renovations for school kitchens? And what about logistical space additions to support increased distribution of foods or programming?
I can take it, and Heidi, you can answer. But yes, I think I did see that in the funding description that they do want us to improve facilities to allow them to be able to serve serve food just like they did during COVID. A lot of the facilities were serving food even when the facilities were not occupied by students. They do want, they do say that is one of the ways to improve, to use the funding, is to ensure that is possible in facilities.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything in terms of remodeling, alterations, additions that can be tied to improving the health environment, as well as promoting social distancing and the ability for our students and our staff to safely return to in-person.
Kaz, here's a technical question for you. Can you describe what ionization is and why it might be useful?
So hold on, you broke up just for a moment. Say that again. Was it ionization?
I'm sorry, the question is, can you describe what bipolar ionization is and why it might be useful?
So bipolar ionization is basically a process where you have a piece of equipment that goes through, and through basically electrical charge, you are charging specific particulates. So when you look at filtration, I kind of said that, you know, there's this thing called a MERV rating, and all of those different MERV ratings basically say that they are so effective. And what I mean by so effective is there's a sliding scale. So the number that you keep hearing from like ASHRAE and these other organizations is you want to have a MERV 13. Well, in certain cases, you don't always have the ability to just apply a MERV 13 filter to that piece of equipment. So you might be stuck with something much less. And we won't get into any of the numbers or anything, but the idea of this bipolar ionization is that more or less it is charging different particles, particulates are coming together and allowing the particulates to be captured in a better sense through a lesser filter media device. So when you're looking at this, you basically you're treating air as it's flowing through, you're charging particles so that things stick together, so that even a lesser filter has a better ability to collect different particulates and other matter that's within the airstream. So some of the challenges, of course, are out there are some of these different devices will generate ozone. So there's some specific guidelines from the EPA and ASHRAE. There's a UL listing that's out there. So when I kind of said you need to talk to your professional, there's a lot of specific requirements when you look at like a bipolar ionization kit for its application, how it works, what are the pieces of equipment you can kind of attach that to.
Thank you, Kaz. And I'm looking to my left at the chat box here. Question that just came in. What about the process? Heidi, I believe, can you discuss the requirements of documenting? Federal government requires specific guidelines to be followed, the 34 CFR and Davis-Bacon requirements, for instance. Can anyone speak to that, or is that something maybe we should follow up on after?
I think it's going to require a deeper follow-on conversation, but that question that person brings up a good question in terms of like construction, remodeling. We are going to have to follow federal requirements when it comes to not only the Davis-Bacon federal wage rates, but also the procurement process that they use. So there are a lot of underlying requirements. And again, I don't think we have time to discuss those, but please know that there are requirements and documentation and reporting that goes along with this funding.
Okay. Well, we've got 5 minutes left here. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thanks for the thoughtful questions that came in from the audience. Thank you to each of our panelists. Before we go, I want to ask each panelist simply this. For those who are listening, from your perspective, what's one thing that you want them to remember from today's discussion? And Kaz, let's start with you.
So what I would like to say is that just remember that every building's different. Every system is going to be different, and it is best to work with a professional to really assess your building, your system, and really understand kind of what that overall, how is that system performing? And then really kind of rely on that professional to provide you a list of potential improvements that should be made that really best respond for your building, your systems, for your situation, your climate, from that kind of overall lens of funding assistance. Where are the best use of those dollars to really make the best improvements?
So insofar as building systems go, begin with a question about what works and what doesn't. Do a buildings assessment, engage a professional to do that assessment so that you know where the needs lie. Okay, thank you. Shivani?
I want to actually end with a definition of health by WHO, because I think it is very relevant for the conversation today. WHO defines health to not just be the absence of disease. It is actually the state of complete physical, social, and mental well-being. I know it took us a disease like COVID to talk about health and wellness of occupants, but I'm so glad that we are doing it. I know green building rating systems like LEED and WELL have been talking about how important facilities are in determining health of users because of how much time we spend indoors. And the indoor environmental quality, the mental stress, all of these conversations are so critical. And I'm so glad we are talking about it in light of COVID, but I think these improvements are going to help our users for years to come.
So in the same way that educators talk about the whole child as being something broader than just the intellectual development of that child, think about health more broadly, not just in relation to COVID, not just relationship to physical illness, but also just the overall health and well-being, including mental health and well-being. Thank you, Shivani. And Heidi.
If our attendees remember one thing, I would like it to be planning with an equity lens. We have some time with this funding to allow for purposeful planning and collaboration with our area political subdivisions, so the cities, counties, and state. As the second slide that we showed related to the full ARP funding, there are a lot of entities that received money. But there's a lot of needs out there. So I think collaboration and planning with our neighbors is important as we try and fill as many gaps as possible, and paying special attention to our underserved student populations. And of course, we also want to avoid duplication of efforts.
Okay, thank you. Well, seeing no other questions come in, I'd like to thank our panelists, Heidi, Kaz, Shivani, and on their behalf and on behalf of all of our colleagues at Stantec, I want to thank everybody for joining us. And I wish everybody a very good day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions, you can see our emails down there. You can follow up with any of us. Forgot to mention that. Have a good day.